So for much of this course, we're looking at community journalism in particular and at online models, but of course there are many other kinds of community media, and so we want to broaden the conversation out a little, and I'm joined by Dr Arne Hintz from Cardiff University, who's obviously looked at other forms of community media around the world. So Arne, what are some of the other forms beyond journalism, if you like, that the community media is taking?
Yeah, community media is one of the important terms, of course, of our field, and bit like public service media, a bit like alternative media, social media, and so on. And so there are a number of types and a number of criteria, perhaps, when we talk about community media. First of all, it is, of course, like community journalism. It is related to a community, which can be a local geographic community, but not necessarily. It's also a community of interest sometimes. It's a community of practice. It can be a fan community, a cultural community. It can be a diaspora community that is really located in different parts of the world, across borders, in different localities. Typically, it's not just for the community, but also by the community. So it is not necessarily, or typically not owned by a company, by a business entity, but by the community, by an association that is located within the community, as part of the community. And it is typically open for participation, both in terms of content production, for people to produce their own shows on the radio or to write their own articles, but also in management and in running the station and running the media organization. So participation, and similar to how we understand citizen media, is very relevant for most community media. And then in relation to that, also, of course, mostly a non-profit approach. So of course, community media typically have income around advertising and so on, but mostly they have a non-profit approach. They have a social goal, not a profit goal. Of course, in different parts of the world, this is interpreted differently. Yeah. And we have, in some places like Japan, for example, the concept often includes local commercial media. In other countries like Sri Lanka, like Bolivia, we've had community radios, in this case, that were set up by the state, by the government, and continue to be funded. So there's a bit of the blurring of this division line between commercial entities and state entities. In the country where I'm from Germany, there are different forms of community radio. There are the free radios that are really set up by activists, grassroots-based, run by people from the community. And then there are others, there are the so-called open channels that are set up and owned most of the time by regulators or by other institutions, and provide a platform for people to produce their own shows. So there are different ideas, different ways this concept is like materializes.
So it's interesting. You mentioned community radio there as a form of community media that's taken off in many places, and yet some people would say, well, radio is complicated, needs lots of kit and equipment, and it's expensive and so on. So how has community radio developed? How has it grown up?
Yeah, that's actually interesting, because it seems to be very popular because it is very often easy to set up. Despite the kit and all that, there are many, of course, urban pirate radio stations, and there are also local community radios in rural areas, in poor areas. In a country like Brazil, there are thousands of community radios or unlicensed small radios at any point in time. So, or recently at least. So it is quite interesting, actually, that in times when we talk about social media and when there's this enthusiasm about online communication, radio continues to be very popular, and sometimes it is even becoming more popular.
Because often that's in rural areas, like parts of Africa, where there may not be good internet connection, and it may be hard to be able to physically distribute things. But of course, radio is very accessible. If you've got a shortwave radio or something, and it's quite easy to be able to pick up, whereas the internet or even newspapers and print may be more difficult.
Yes, and in addition to that, it's of course voice-based. It does not require literacy. It does not require reading. It is therefore an important medium, or the main medium perhaps, in some areas where there are high illiteracy levels. It is very direct and immediate, which again makes it a communication medium in some parts of the world, but also makes it popular still here in the North, in the UK. in the UK, in this country, over the past 10 years, I think there were over 200 new radio stations that emerged that actually got a license, community radio stations. And so it is actually a growing phenomenon, even in times of social media.
So, and what are some of the different purposes of community radio in this way, the different kinds of content, the different functions of radio as it springs up around the place?
Yeah, as you said, it relates very much to the context, to the environment where it emerges. And there are rural radio stations in part of Africa where, of course, the content focused then on, let's say, farming techniques and exchanging information about that is really relevant. In other parts of the world, like in London, there are radio stations with more cultural content and so on. Obviously. Yeah, exactly. And there are different forms. So what is important for community radios, community media generally, but particularly then for the radios, usually is the question, how does it bring a community together? How is it relevant for a community in terms of the content, as we mentioned? But then also in other ways, does it bring the community together physically? Where often these radios are physical meeting places where people come together. Sometimes it's more of a virtual meeting place where people phone in and request that a certain information is distributed over the channels, and then to get in touch with other people. It's kind of a communication medium. In conflict zones, sometimes it can be useful to bring. There are actually community radio experiments in Cyprus, for example, trying to bring together communities from both sides and so on. There are experiences from Colombia where community radio has been relevant to try to overcome some conflict situations. Then, does it give a voice to groups and cultures that are marginalized? Does it empower these people by providing a channel to contribute their voices, their perspectives, their views? Does it train people in production skills and in maybe journalist skills and so on? That's usually something that the community radios do. So these are important important goals, and often more so than the question, how professional is the journalism? What are the audience figures and so on? And so when we look at community media, I think it's important to look at these wider perspectives, these wider goals.
Social impact is a crucial success rather than traditional commercial measures.
Yes.
How far are these kind of community radio stations in particular grassroots operations or foundation funded, or indeed sometimes commercial companies coming in to try and do something on a hyperlocal level?
Yes, there, as I said at the beginning, there are many different types, and so we see all of that. Now, the classic pure model, of course, would be something that is really organized locally, set up and run and managed by people from the community, by activists, in a grassroots fashion, not set up by the state, not set up by commercial entities. But of course, there are gray zones, and sometimes community media emerge in other ways. Often, of course, as a non-profit media, they need funding, and so often foundations provide that funding, so that's important. Also, when they emerge in the global south, and they're sometimes part of development strategies, and so on.
But presumably, some of them, therefore, are, if you like, official and licensed to use spectrum, whereas many others would be pirate radio, effectively, won't they?
Yes. So traditionally, we would have both, and traditionally probably would have more unlicensed pirate radio stations. Sometimes this is then transformed into an actual official licensed station, as we could see here in this country, in the UK. For many decades we had pirate radio stations, and then there have been campaigns for legalizing them, for handing out licenses, and that took, I think, about 20 years or so, these campaigns, and then finally in 2003 law changed and new policies emerged to actually also hand out licenses legally to community radio stations. Similar trends actually emerge in other parts of the world. We saw legal changes, policy changes in huge countries, the biggest countries of South Asia and Africa, India and Nigeria, legalized community radio in, I think, around 2008, 2009. And in 2010, we had a new law in the US, which also legalized what they call their low power FM. So in many countries, we've had this interesting trend actually that was what was once a little bit kind of on the pirate side, a little bit subversive, and did not have much space to operate legally, is now increasingly recognized as the third media sector, and especially the third broadcast sector, in addition to public service broadcasting and commercial broadcasting.
And you're saying that community radio as a sector is still growing quite rapidly, because of course we think of radio sometimes as a bit of an old-fashioned medium in the digital age, but actually it seems to have got new life in this community context.
Yes, and it's still very popular. It's still increasingly popular, apparently, surprisingly sometimes, and it's also increasingly recognized as an important media sector, and therefore also supported in policy and law. In this country, in the UK, we've had a new community media law in, I think, 2003. In other countries, like for example India and Nigeria, the biggest countries population-wise, in South Asia and in Africa, we've seen the legalization of community radio in 2008, 2009, around that. In 2010 in the US, there was a new law to legalize low-power FM, as they call it there. So there's this trend to actually provide more and more also legal space for these radios to exist, to hand out licenses. I think the most exciting changes recently in this respect have taken place in Latin America, where government changes across the continent since 1998 and then particularly in the 2000s have led to quite significant media policy changes and a greater role for public service media and community media. It's really interesting when we look at new laws that emerged, for example, in Argentina and Uruguay. Actually, they reserve 1/3 of the radio frequency spectrum for community and non-profit broadcasting, as they call it in Argentina, for example. And so they go far beyond, in a way, to the regulations and the policies that we have in other parts of the world, that we have here, for example. They have tried to bring community media out of the niche that it traditionally had, and to say, well, it's one of the 3 important broadcasting sectors, so we should reserve 1/3 of the spectrum for it. And that's a very interesting trend, I think, that is picked up in other countries. Most recently in Ecuador, there has been some media policy change also to adopt this mechanism. In Europe, we've seen some very strong declarations by the European Parliament, by the Council of Europe in favor of community media in around 2008, 2009. And overall, I think an increasing recognition in many countries that community media constitutes some kind of a third sector, complementing, community broadcasting at least, complementing public service broadcasting and commercial broadcasting.
And has an important role to play in terms of community and social cohesion and so on as well.
Yes.
So we've talked elsewhere on this course about community newspapers, community websites. We talked a lot about community radio. Is there community TV, examples of community TV or other forms of community media anyway?
Yeah, it does exist, and it's not as prominent usually as a radio, because it's often a little bit more difficult to set up. The spaces in the law and media policy are not that clear cut, but there are open channels for community TV in several countries. In the US, there have been public access windows in public service broadcasting for quite a while, and so there are some smaller windows and niches for community TV.
And we have a community TV channel here in the UK, of course, which is open to community contributions too.
And so that is part of it. Community radio is the most prominent sector, but community TV and other forms of also video activism and so on are part of the mix. Yeah.
Okay, Arne, thanks very much indeed.
Thanks.